Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail.
Hello! So it's one per household, and I just need your house number.
977.
977, wonderful. Have a good day.
This is a woman at a water distribution site outside an elementary school in Iqaluit. She's handing out cases of water to residents who've been told not to drink or ingest in any way what's coming out of their taps. This after people started complaining earlier this month that the water smelled like gasoline. And since then, Iqaluit's 9,000 residents, the majority of them Inuit, had to figure out how to get water as the city investigates exactly how this happened.
So they did immediately start investigating, taking water samples from the households that were reporting the smell. Those test samples, however, they kept saying, we're coming back satisfactory and there was nothing of concern.
Willow Fiddler is a national news reporter for The Globe, and she's been following the story from Thunder Bay, where she's based. Our health reporter, Kelly Grant, was in Iqaluit over the weekend talking to residents, so you'll hear some of their voices throughout this interview. That's today on the show. You're listening to The Decibel. Willow, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Can we start with what does the water in Iqaluit smell like right now?
Right now, it's still smelling like fuel, as it has been since the beginning of the month. Residents first started reporting fuel odor coming from their tap water on October 2nd. Test samples confirmed on Friday by the city that it is hydrocarbons found in a section of the water treatment plant, likely to be diesel fuel or kerosene. And what the latest that we're told is that smell is going to continue to linger and get stronger this week as the city flushes the lines out during its process of cleaning out the lines and tanks of the contamination.
Right. So people first reported smelling this on October 2nd. And since then, have people experienced any kind of health effects from drinking this water?
There's been reports people have felt ill, things like upset stomach, throwing up. We heard from the public health officer last week that people who did consume the water or were exposed to it could expect to experience those kinds of symptoms as the hydrocarbons pass through their system. They weren't concerned of any long-term effects and that the symptoms would be gone within hours of consuming the water.
I did heard that people, I think, were actually getting sick already from it and getting headaches. Walter actually he had to brush his teeth because he was getting a toothache, so he brushed his teeth, and this was again the night before they put out the announcement. And after he brushed his teeth, he just got sick, puking. He was throwing up.
And so when the government first heard those initial reports of the smell, how did they respond? What did they do?
So they did immediately start investigating, taking water samples from the households that were reporting the smell. Those test samples, however, they kept saying, we're coming back satisfactory and there was nothing of concern coming back in them. It wasn't until about 10 days later, though, that they did isolate the possible source through an in-ground water tank at the water treatment plant. And they said, when they opened that up, there was a very strong odor of fuel, and those test samples came back with high concentrated levels of hydrocarbons.
Right. Do we know anything at this point about how these hydrocarbons may have gotten into the water supply?
Nothing confirmed yet. They are continuing to investigate. They did say on Friday, they suspect that it got in through a cracked wall in one of the in-ground tanks. That's not confirmed yet. There's also been, some talk from some of the city council members, concerns over whether, climate change is a factor here in melting permafrost in the ground, that could cause shifting and breaking and leaks and stuff like that.
I know the Iqaluit mayor made comments about this. He said, we had a very warm and wet summer here in Iqaluit. And of course, as climate change has been impacting us greatly, I would say that maybe the permafrost melted and our facility may have moved.
Yeah, and also, the other factor here is just the aging infrastructure too that needs replacing, and that's something that we see a lot of in Indigenous communities, particularly First Nations here in Northern Ontario where I am. It's not holding up to things like growing populations, where you have overcrowded housing, climate change, it's just the infrastructure wasn't built to last that long.
You mentioned that Iqaluit is growing as a city. How quickly is it growing?
Good question. I don't have any figures to give you on that. I can tell you that they are short 1,400 homes. So that is going to result in, overcrowded housing where you have multiple families living in one home. And then when you have a water crisis like this that happens where you have to conserve water, that becomes problematic and can contribute to other health problems. Access to clean, safe drinking water is most definitely a health determinant in northern communities.
So what did people actually have to do when they realized that they couldn't drink the tap water?
They would have had to grab a pail and an empty jug, something, a clean water container, and driving to the nearby river, and you literally would walk down to the shore. It's a very rocky shore, and scoop your pail or jug in there and fill it up. I was speaking with one resident who said there was about 12 to 16 vehicles there, and this would have been hours after they were told not to drink the tap water. That night, there was also a rain, a downpour, and that wasn't stopping people. So there was photos, circulating that showed people in the dark in the rain at the river, using the lights, using the headlights from their vehicles to see where they're going to fill up, because what can you do, right? You need water to flush your toilet. You need water to brush your teeth. You need water to make your coffee in the morning. It's something that many of us take for granted and don't really realize what that means when it's no longer accessible to us. The Sylvia Grinnell River is a well-known spot to get fairly safe, clean drinking water. So, it's recommended that they do boil it still before consumption. But we're coming close to the end of October now. I've seen reports, that the river in Iqaluit is starting to freeze. Once you get into the winter months, you kind of run into the risk of other complications happening with freezing water and freezing pipes that can cause, further damage to the infrastructure. And the priority, I think, is making sure they get the contaminants out and lifting the boil water advisory, which sounds like may happen by the end of the week.
I've heard people pointing out that not everyone has access to a car. So how are those people dealing with this?
Well, that's a really great thing that you see happen, in communities, in my experience anyways, First Nations communities and communities with high Indigenous populations, is that people really do come together to support one another. And immediately you identify, the vulnerable people in your community, whether they're elders, disabled, and people who don't have, a vehicle to get to the river to fill it up. So residents helping each other out.
So we tried to set up a buddy system where when we have a car and we can go to the river and get water, and so we wanted to pair with one or two families, and that's what we would do. So whenever we got water, we would get them water. But there's just
you have leaders kind of doing water deliveries. The Nunavut government and other organizations have been flying in hundreds of thousands of liters of bottled water and making sure households and everybody has access to that, especially families with young children who are more vulnerable to contaminated water.
Is there a way to buy water from the supermarket?
Well, there's a North Mart there, which is kind of the main grocery store department type of store for northern communities, and another store there. They were sold out of their bottled water, I think, that day. Of course, bottled water is going to be kind of the safest thing you can get your hands on. But that comes at a cost when you're in remote communities like that too. The price, well, it's outrageous. I mean, a 24 pack of water, bottled water, would cost you like $40 or something, right? I mean, it's not like the $2, $5 pack that you can pick up at Walmart or wherever.
Yeah.
So, hundreds of thousands of liters of bottled water have been flown in since, and making sure that everybody has access to that supply as well.
Yeah. And I know you've been talking to people. How are people feeling about all of this?
I think you just have to ask yourself, I mean, how would you react if you all of a sudden couldn't, use your tap water? It can be scary. It can be overwhelming.
Even just 2 big jugs, that's not enough for a day, because we need it for cooking, and we needed it for washing hands before they said it's okay to wash hands or brush your teeth or even bathe. So we stopped taking a bath or showers, of course, and we need to use water for like everything, and it's not enough. Like, it's never enough.
So I wonder if we can put this story in a broader context. So there are still over 40 First Nations communities in Canada that are under boil water advisories. 86% of Nunavut's population is Indigenous. Is what's happening in Iqaluit right now at all related to that bigger story?
For sure. I think it's an issue of infrastructure, right? And that's the main thing with our First Nations here, too, is the infrastructure is inadequate. It wasn't built to support communities and their growth. It compounds with many other problems, overcrowded housing and other issues that Indigenous people and communities face, like poverty and trauma. And we see that in Iqaluit, too. The difference, however, is for First Nations, water infrastructure is a federal responsibility under Indigenous services, whereas Iqaluit is not a First Nation. They are a municipality. Residents pay for their water there, but they've got, I think, similar challenges in that how do you address aging infrastructure when it's something that's in the $100 million mark, right?
That's the cost, $100 million, to update the infrastructure.
Right. And yeah, and it's just, like I said, compounds with so many other problems, right? I mean, Iqaluit can't build any more houses right now because they don't have the water and sewage infrastructure to do that. So, it backs things up, and it kind of just perpetuates these cycles that we see in Indigenous communities.
So I also understand that this is Iqaluit's third water emergency in 4 years, right? What do you make of that? And why has this happened so many times in the last 4 years?
There's different things that can cause water advisories, whether they're kind of natural occurrences, as I mentioned, with contaminations, or kind of compounded problems that you see breakdowns that are indicative of the, old infrastructure that needs replacing.
Well, the city has been going through somewhat of a water crisis for quite some time over the last few years, as we've had some water scarcity issues with our water reservoir unable to meet the demand throughout the year. So there's definitely a need to assist the city in meeting its needs, and I really hope that it'll be an ideal time for the government of Nunavut and the government of Canada to come together with the city to help address our water situation, not only this current water crisis, but the long-term needs that we will be having.
I think the previous advisories have been able to be resolved fairly quickly and not at the level that this is in terms of the contamination, that it's not a natural contamination, that they haven't been able to, determine what the source is yet.
But it's probably fair to say that what's happening in Iqaluit is not something that you would expect to happen in a place like Toronto.
No, definitely not.
And why is that, do you think?
Well, part of it is because these are rural and remote communities. A lot of it is kind of logistical challenges, but these aren't issues or problems that are impossible to fix or address either. I've heard many people say, there's just a lack of political will to really address the problems, and that Band-Aid solutions just aren't appropriate, and that Band-Aid solutions are only good for so long, right?
Okay, Willow, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this.
My pleasure.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. Michal Stein edited this episode. David Crosby edits the show, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Willow Fiddler and Kelly Grant for the interviews you heard in this episode. You can find more of their work at theglobeandmail.com. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.